Welcome back, Wolfpack. Verlis here to an EV training guide for Pokemon Sun and Moon. And no, we are not talking about the Pokemon EV. We are talking about effort values. Now, if you already know what effort values are, there will be an annotation on screen and probably something in the description. Click on that to find out how EV training works in the 7th generation. But since this is also a beginner guide, keep watching to understand what effort values even are. So, a basic rundown of what an effort value is. You might be hearing your friends talk about it. You might know that it has something to do with competitive, but you don't quite fully understand it. Let's take a Pokemon, for example, like Pick-a-Peck. It will give you effort values which directly impact a stat that the Pokemon that knocked it out. So let's just say your Charmander knocks out a Pick-a-Peck, you're going to gain effort values and eventually stat points. And to figure out which kind of stats are going to be modified, you will need to do some extra research. Going on a website like Cerebi and then looking up the Pokemon will show a little section of what effort values are boosted by what Pokemon. So for example, right here, Pick-a-Peck has 1 attack point when KO'd, which means all we have to do is KO Pick-a-Peck with Charmander, and we get 1 EV in attack, and it's the same for everything. Generally, the rule of thumb is that whatever the Pokemon is strongest at, but not always, will gain effort values. So something like Abra will be special attack, and just the best way to double check is by looking on a resource like this and then trying to get that there. Also, later on this guide, you'll find out the best locations for training a specific stat for all of your main stats. So now I think that the best way of describing how effort values affect a Pokemon is by going into Pokemon Showdown. So right now, we are on a battle simulator, and you might have actually played around with these before but still not know what's going on. Like, oh, if I just put a 252 right here, things start to make sense, and then my Pokemon looks pretty strong. So at level 100, gain 63 points in any stat by maxing out the effort values of that stat, but you notice that you can't max out every stat. And that's what all these numbers are for. So you're going to want to pay attention to this right here for your remaining EVs, because every Pokemon has the ability to put 508 EVs into any of its stats with a cap of 252 for a single stat. And you also might notice that roughly every 4 EVs is going to be 1 point for that Pokemon, so 224, 225, 226, and then that means we have to KO 4 Pick-a-Pecks to be able to gain 1 point in our attack, and this works for any Pokemon, regardless of its base stat total, regardless of base stats. That's just kind of how it breaks down. Now, IVs are going to be something else entirely that I will be doing a separate guide on later, so you might want to subscribe and also like this video, share it with your friends, understand how competitive Pokemon battling works. So the idea is we can play around with stats and we can make a Pokemon as strong as we want it. There's also no limit as to how weird we can get with it. We can put any number of EVs and any number of stats, and this also applies to the Pokemon that you get throughout your journey. Now, an interesting side effect of effort values is that you actually get these during your first playthrough of the game, that this isn't anything post-game, it's always happening. So depending on the Pokemon that you're KOing throughout the game, you might actually get some really wonky stats throughout your playthrough, and you might get lucky and not know what's going on and have a stronger Pokemon than average, or you might have a really weakened Pokemon because you're putting effort values in the wrong place. Say you have a physical attacking Pokemon and you're KOing only special attack effort value Pokemon, it's going to get kind of weird, but pretty much as long as you just fall within 508 total EVs, 252 in any stat, you're free to do whatever you want, and the outcome can be pretty interesting. Now, a way you can also check if a Pokemon already has existing EVs because you might have battled with it or something is items like iron, protein, or any of those really expensive medicines that whenever it says you can't use anymore, well, that's because that Pokemon already has 100 in that effort value. So let's go and use protein, for example. Say we have 168 EVs in attack just from whatever miscellaneous training we've had, well, the protein won't affect it. However, if we have 72 or something like that, we will be able to boost it with there. So you'll know roughly if any EVs have been put into that, and also if you have a certain amount, you can kind of just test the waters with that. Or say you know for sure that you have not gotten any defensive EVs on a Pokemon, if you use an item on it and it says it won't work, well, that means the Pokemon is fully EV trained, and it will not accept any more EVs because it has reached its cap. Now, as for why we use EVs, it's mostly going to be stat optimization. So you'll notice on websites like Cerebi, if you scroll down to the bottom of the page, it'll show like stat ranges, and that's what base stat totals are representative of. That it's pretty much the effective cap that a Pokemon can have. So with a neutral nature, which means nothing being affected, you can have 417 special attack on a Pokemon like Charizard Y. So this is why we're going to be playing with those ranges. That by maxing out our EVs, we can hit the fullest potential of this Pokemon based on its base stats, and also speed is going to be a pretty big one. Generally, you're going to see a big investment on speed for sweeping Pokemon, and then whatever you want for offenses or bulk tankiness, but this is where speed ties are won. This is how a Pokemon is faster than another Pokemon. That's since outspeeding a Pokemon is an advantage over that Pokemon, speed EVs and IVs are going to be some of the most important things on certain Pokemon. Now, tanky Pokemon with low base speeds, they don't really care as much, but when you're starting to get with like speed ties and very close numbers on very fast sweeping Pokemon, this is where it starts to matter, and then you can kind of do whatever. Also, you will end up with a 4th stat point. Now, some people, they'll tech it into hit points, defense, or special defense, that those 4 EVs might subtract 1 point of damage in specific scenarios, but at the same time, people have survived and won games off of just surviving with 1 or 2 hit points, so it's not absolutely useless, but it can be somewhat of an afterthought. But if you are going for splits, then the numbers will eventually play themselves out, and that's why you might see something like a 128, 128, and then 252, depending on the Pokemon you're running. This is why in moveset, you might see all kinds of different EVs or kind of spreads, especially when you receive a document from someone else. So that's kind of the idea of how EVs work. So in Pokemon Sun and Moon, there is no super training, but we can still see the EVs of our Pokemon. All we have to do is go to the Pokemon stats and summary page and then press Y. Press Y, and then we get to see everything that we need to know. So that's going to be the Pokemon's total stats and stuff like that, but when you press Y, it'll show a different thing. Now, when it's all blue, that shows that the Pokemon has maxed out EVs. It'll also show for the maxed out stat as well, because it gets all shiny and stuff, but the Pokemon has not received full EVs yet. It will be an orange next to that yellow. So there we go, guys. Now, I will admit, I just learned this today, right before making this guide. Actually, during the guide. Either way, that's something that happens. So yeah, there's also different ways of EV training as well. Now in the 7th generation, EV training is going to be different from the 6th generation, that there are no hordes in the 7th generation, but instead we're going to be working off of the S.O.S system, where a Pokemon calls help from another Pokemon, and that's where Adrenaline Orbs come into play. So you can go to a shop and then get Adrenaline Orbs, and this is pretty much just going to expedite the process. That you don't need Adrenaline Orbs to be able to do an SOS. That you might have actually noticed this through your regular playthrough. A Pokemon gets low, it calls for help, and this is actually a way of modifying effort values, and we'll talk about the specific numbers. So an Adrenaline Orb, using it makes Pokemon more likely to call for help, and also hit points are going to be affected as well. That the lower the Pokemon is on hit points, the more likely it is to call for help, and while the help won't always come, it's pretty much just a thing of cycling through a couple of turns, knocking out the Pokemon that it called for help, having it call help again, and then have that happen again. So we will need a couple of things like Adrenaline Orbs, and we will also need a Pokemon with False Swipe. That way we can just hit a Pokemon really hard, drop it down to 1 hit points, use the Adrenaline Orb, and it's pretty much going to be attempting to call for help every turn, and maybe it might miss a turn here or there. Now, while a Pokemon won't always come, as I've already mentioned before, it's still going to be very frequent, so as long as you're just knocking out the new Pokemon, you'll start to add up those EVs really quickly, and that's pretty much the system. Like, it sounds a lot more complicated than it really is, but once you Adrenaline Orb, False Swipe, it kind of writes itself, and they just keep knocking out the new Pokemon, and now that's pretty much all there is to it. So other than that, we will need locations as to where Pokemon are going to work, and if some of them are day and night specific, all you have to do is go to the altar in your game. So in my case, I'm at the altar of the sun, but I'm in moon version, so I go back to the altar of the moon, and pretty much just is going to flip the time around, which means if it's nighttime, you can make it daytime and then fight a Yungoos and gain attack EVs. Now, it's actually super easy to EV train in Pokemon Sun and Moon because you only need a couple of locations. So at Route 2, in the beginning of the route, we can encounter most of the Pokemon that we need for most of the EVs. We can see right here that Alolan, Rattata, and Meowth give speed EVs, that we also can encounter Drowsy, which gives special defense, attack off of the Yungoos, and then hit points on the Makuhita. Now, Makuhita will be one of those like rustling grass encounters, but if you get that encounter, then you can still use the Adrenaline Orb, and it will cycle through right there, and that's pretty much it. I think the biggest point right here is that you need to make it daytime if you want attack EVs for Yungoos, and that's kind of it. So if you need that, just run to the altar and everything will be okay. Now, the thing is, not every Pokemon will call upon itself, therefore you need specific routes and stuff like that. These Pokemon will always call their respective counterparts, and then you can keep farming them for EVs. Now, if you want special attack EVs, just go to the Thrifty Megamart and wait for a Haunter encounter. Haunter actually gives 2 EVs to start, and it can even call Gengar sometimes, which gives you 3 EVs in special attack. So the snowball and the amount of EVs you're going to be getting is going to go very fast, which means you can actually max out EVs in just a couple of turns for a single stat. And then if you want defense, that is going to be Route 12. On Route 12, you can find Torkoal. Torkoal gives 2 defense EVs, and again, it will only call itself. So that's kind of it. You go to one of these locations, Route 2, the Thrifty Megamart, or Route 12, and you'll be able to max out any Pokemon stats off of the encounters you find there. Now, not all of the encounter rates are 100%, so it might take a little time for that first encounter, but once you get that, that stat is effectively maxed out. So let's go and read what Cerebi has to say about how many encounters it takes. Effort points yielded from each Pokemon are multiplied by 2, which results in effort values you receive being increased. As such, the power item in Pokerush, you can get 36 effort points from one Pokemon being defeated and max out a stat in 7 KOs in a chain. Now this will drop to 6 KOs if you are going to be doing a 2 EV Pokemon, and if some other Pokemon kind of jump in, say the Gengar for example, just try to go for 6 and then that stat will be maxed out. Now this does make it a little difficult for pinpointing specifics, but at the same time, power items and Pokerus were mentioned, so let's go and talk about those as well. Power items will increase EV yield by 4 per Pokemon knocked out, and Pokerus doubles all EV yields as well. So if we knock out 1 or 2 Pokemon, we can kind of do the math and try to figure out the range for what we need on those specific EVs. So by comparison to Horde battles, it's going to be effectively quicker. That depends on how often the Pokemon are called and how fast you can knock out the opposing Pokemon, but at the same time, it took roughly 5 Horde battles to be able to get it, because each Pokemon gave 10, you got 5 times 10, that was 50, and then you also need to do an extra encounter or an extra Horde battle, so 6 Horde battles to max out a stat. All of this is just going to be 7 KOs inside of a chain, so as long as you're chaining the Pokemon on the left side and you keep knocking it out, you're going to just build up to 7, and then that stat gets maxed out pretty quickly as well. It's just going to make it a little more difficult for those pinpointed stats, and you will need power items and Pokerus, so let's talk about how to get the power items. In the Battle Dome, you can earn battle points and then spend them on these items, and then the items tell you what they do. For example, the Power Weight gives you hit points, Power Anklet gives you speed. That's kind of it. Now, you will need to be wary that experience share also works for effort values. So if you have a Pokemon that you don't want earning attack effort values, then don't have it when you're out farming Yungoos or any kind of other Pokemon. So pretty much you just want to fill up your party with only Pokemon that you want for that stat, and then you can max out stats very quickly with that, especially if all the Pokemon have those power items equipped. But also, since EVs are doubled, you can just stay in a chain for a really long time or do it while shiny hunting. That shiny odds are increased while chaining via this method, so you can just kind of go for a really long chain, and then by the time you get a shiny, most likely all those Pokemon will have a stat maxed out as well, so you can double dip right there, or you can go for the maximum efficiency with 7 total encounters, or maybe a little more if you cannot get those items on every single one of your Pokemon. So that is a little thing to be aware of. Don't give the wrong EVs to a Pokemon. I've done it, everyone's done it, that's just something right there. And then also, Pokerus. So Pokerus is very interesting, that a Pokemon will have Pokerus for a short amount of time, and that time is suspended while that Pokemon is in the PC. So if you put it there, it's okay, but if it's out in your party, even if your DS is off, even if you're not playing the game, the counter will tick down on it, and then the Pokemon will be cured of Pokerus, but it will always have the effects. So Pokerus doubles all effort gains, which means, yeah, that's why we get such a crazy snowball when it comes to this chaining method right here, and it will transfer Pokerus to other Pokemon in the party. So pretty much if you get one Pokemon with Pokerus, it's good forever as long as you don't screw up. You know, give it to an entire party of Pokemon or 2, and then just have an entire PC box of Pokerus Pokemon, and then you can also share this with your friends. You know, trade away a Pokerus Pokemon to a friend, then they can go and infect all their Pokemon and share it. So in a very short amount of time, not everyone right now, currently, since I'm doing this guide as the game is coming out, not everyone right now has Pokerus, but pretty much as we get later on, a lot of the Wonder Trades that you'll find, a lot of just people on the GTS will have Pokerus Pokemon. Your friends might pick up some Pokerus as well, and then it's just going to spread that way. So if you really want to get it, either go on Reddit, ask around, tweet, ask some friends, and then try to get Pokerus that way, or you can just spam the Wonder Trade, because eventually there's just going to be a lot of people eventually giving away Wonder Trade Pokemon with that Pokerush. You might get lucky, and then things can happen. Now, Pokerus originally starts from an incredibly rare encounter. It's actually harder to get Pokerus than it is to find a natural shiny Pokemon without any modification through like a shiny charm or chaining in some kind of way. So with this, it's going to be rare for you to find it on your own, but that's just kind of the social nature of Pokerus, that once one person gets it, a lot of people can get it as well, and then it just kind of keeps growing exponentially from there. It's actually a pretty effective virus when you think about it, so don't sweat it if you don't get Pokerus early. You pretty much just need to double the overall effort yield, which means, again, you'll be in the chain for longer, but it's still a very quick method that even before Horde battling, let's go into, like, this is pretty much it for the guide, and then I'm just going to have a little bit of like a history rant for you guys, because back in the 5th generation, back in the 4th generation, we didn't have these extra things. It was just one Pokemon battle. So you knocked out one Pokemon, you got 10 EVs, and you had to go and repeat that 26 times. roughly, or something like that. And then you did have that precision, but you still have the precision now, that if you encounter a single Pokemon that yields 1 EV normally, well, after you go give it the power item, that bumps it up to 5, then it doubles to 10, so you can get roughly 40 to 80, even in a short amount of time like that, if you are looking for those specific EVs. Now, Hordes, as I mentioned, did give much more EVs, 50 per battle as opposed to 10, so with the power items and stuff back in 4th and 5th generation, it was still difficult, which means pretty much no matter what happens. Pretty much no matter how you do it in the 7th generation, as long as you're chaining, as long as you have these items, even without Pokerus, even without the items, it's still going to be pretty quick to max out a stat for a Pokemon. And then, as I talked about earlier, you just change around whatever stats. Or you could just keep it simple, max out 2 stats in 2 battles, and now you have a Pokemon that's ready to sweep, especially on Route 2. On Route 2, you encounter an Alolan Meowth or even a Smeargle. Smeargle also gives speed EVs as well. So you encounter Smeargle, you encounter Yungoos, you do the full chains, and now you have a Pokemon that's ready, say a Weavile, since I was already using Sneasel for the false swipe. That Pokemon counts. Any physical sweeper that needs to be fast and have high attack, that's how easy it is to EV train in Pokemon Sun and Moon. So if you guys enjoyed the video, hope you all have a nice day. Thank you very much for watching.